Oh man. So I've got a video for you today. I'm going to try to do one of these crazy videos that I occasionally do where I read from multiple books and try to put together kind of a complicated subject matter into a digestible car vid. But I apologize in advance because I might fail in connecting the pieces. And then this video will just be a beautiful mess. which is what most of these videos are anyway, in a good way. And that's the perfect introduction to the subject matter we're going to discuss today. Which is something I've spoken to a few people recently about this, and it's interesting and ties into one of the main things that we always discuss, which is that I think that for many of us, it's helpful to describe a lot of these manifesting ideas and look at them as like almost like weird psychic qualities that we have that are psychologically based and that we just don't really understand. I know for me personally, and a lot of people I've worked with and spoken to, that looking at like manifesting in this way, like in this more down-to-earth way where we just don't really understand it and there's these weird psychological things going on, is just it's easier to digest and to apply than looking at like this manifesting stuff using all the spiritual language. Because as beautiful as the spiritual language often is, and there's so many great manifesting teachers that use spiritual language. I mean, the majority of the manifesting teachers we always talk about on this channel are using very spiritual language. But as great as it is, it can get us confused. It can seem too religious. It can seem to tie up a narrative about what God is supposed to be. It can just really confuse us some of the time. As helpful as it sometimes can be, this really spiritual, grandiose language can often confuse us as well. I think, at least in my case, and many of the people I've worked with over the years, I've noticed this, and that's why I always come back to Kuwait. Because, Kuwait says this is the stuff that we're talking about here basically is just these natural abilities that the human body has, and there's all this imaginative stuff, like seemingly psychic stuff that the human beings can do that we don't really understand, but we can work with it. We can learn to better utilize it. And that's what Kuwait points out really well, using non-religious, non-spiritual language. Maxwell Maltz is another good example of somebody who does this well. He doesn't use that much spiritual language. He uses much more down-to-earth, psychological-sounding language. Which brings me to my next point, which is something that I find interesting is that most of the deep spiritual teachers I found, like the deepest spiritual teachers, like they're not really talking about manifesting stuff all that much. Or if they do, it's always kind of like this supplementary or side, not the main topic they're discussing at all. And I made a podcast episode when I started the podcast a few years ago. I'll put a link above to it, where I just talk about like manifesting stuff is this very practical, you could just say psychologically practical, as we just mentioned, form of like spirituality, right? And that's why I say, like, we don't even have to call it spiritual usually, even though most teachers do. We could just use psychological terms the way that Emil Coué does, the way that Maxwell Maltz usually does, and that would be enough. It's that practical. Like, it's so practical that we can throw the spirituality out of it, and it's still just this practical psychology, this weird psychic stuff that humans can do. That's very different, in my opinion, than this, like, the deep spiritual mystical teachings, which are very, very hard to explain in like a psychological way, in like a practical way, and is much more about like experiential. You just feel them, you just know them. And I'm talking specifically about like Zen, a lot of Zen teachings or non-dual teachings or any type of mystical teaching that's like, it's not pointing at anything except for the quote unquote truth. But the truth cannot be made into a particular philosophy, or, it can't be a certain teaching narrative, because the truth knocks out any type of narrative as soon as it gets to it. It's too deep. And it sets us free for this reason. That's a very different thing than the manifesting stuff, in my opinion. And I've never been able to totally bring the two together, nor would I want to, I don't think. But what's interesting is that a lot of these manifesting teachers and New Age, New Thought type teachers, as I said, they use all this grandiose spiritual language. Even though, in my opinion, this stuff's not that spiritual. It's just this weird psychic stuff that we have going. And it makes it so... it gets so confusing. But I also just don't know what the heck they're talking about a lot of the time. Like, those people, you'll see them on YouTube sometimes. And I like some of these people. Like, there's certain like teachers and manifesting New Age type teachers that it's like it's all about bliss, and like they're like blissed out, right? They say how like they're blissed out. You're like, oh, they're so blissed out. I just don't. It's not that a lot of that stuff when I see them, like, I just don't believe it at all. I'm like, this person is just full of shit. But then there are some people where you're like, well, this person really might be just in this state of like bliss, like this, they're blissed out, I guess, right? But it seems so disconnected from like the deep spiritual, mystical, can't explain it, bam, bam, bam type of, I guess you could say, spiritual bliss that I've seen that some teachers have. Because the spiritual bliss that I've seen and perhaps experienced in some small way myself, is much more this calm, like peaceful undercurrent to everything. It's not like this high state of ecstasy or bliss, right? Where it's like, oh, everything's just amazing. Things are amazing. It's much more just like grounded, like a state of equanimity that's very okay with whatever's going on. That's like spiritual bliss, in my opinion, or spiritual peace. But I'm not discounting some of these people who say that they're just in this state of euphoric bliss. I guess it's possible. I just have a hard time relating to it. And this leads us to the first reading of today. This is a fucking wild video. I want to read from one of my favorite manifesting teachers, who the book we've been reading several times over the last month or so. I want to read from Richard Dotz's book, Dollars Flow to Me Easily. Because as great a book and as great a teacher as Richard is, and Richard's a great teacher, but as great as he is, a lot of the language that he uses, I cannot relate to, for the reasons I just said. He seems almost blissed out in his language, which is, again, wonderful. And I'm not saying he's not blissed out. I just have a hard time coalescing that with a lot of my experiences. And maybe that's just because I'm a negative Nancy. But there's something to me where like the teacher, like the deepest spiritual teachers that I've seen or had the privilege to meet or have spoken to, like there's usually like this underlying, like their bliss is very understated. And it's not like the language Richard uses here, even though I agree, generally speaking, with what the passage that I'm about to read from Richard. His underlying points about like, manifesting like a better reality for yourself it's just so grandiose, the language he uses. So this is a great passage. I want to give you an example of like the grandiose language that he's using here. It's like very over the top in my opinion. And this is so common in manifesting circles, which is one reason I'm making this video, to give you an example of a great manifesting teacher using this language. Because it's not just like the bad teachers use this language. Almost everybody uses this grandiose language. Anyway, Richard writes here, he's talking about how, like, everything is within you, obviously, right? And how once you realize this, there's nothing to fear, right? He says, when you realize this, what do you have left to fear? No external situation or person can ever have power over you again. So what if you need to start all over again? So what if there's a perceived need to be filled right now in your life? Or even several unfilled needs? All that is illusory and can be changed in an instant. The universe has already met all your needs, not just in a metaphorical way, but in a literal manner. When you turn your focus to the endless flow of abundance on the inside and stay there, you will find that the easy feeling of good, dollars, flowing to you has never diminished. It has been there since the beginning, waiting for you to rediscover the fullness of it. As you rediscover these feelings within yourself, you will experience an unlimited supply of anything you ask for. Abundance, good, money, relationships, and well-being. Stop trying to ask for or attract more. Stop believing that your non-physical good can somehow be exhausted. Stop believing that somehow what you have asked for may not come to you. How do you add more to something that is already infinite? Or subtract something from the wholeness to make it any lesser? You can't. Universal goodness is whole and complete. So will the manifestation of this goodness in your life as riches, abundance, and all the good things in your life experience. So, that's beautiful. And from a manifesting perspective, I think that's great advice. But, as I often say, like, Richard's a great manifesting teacher. It's practical spirituality. Same with someone like Joel Goldsmith, who's throwing all this, talking about God all the time. We're talking about the absolute method, like just focusing on God and things will manifest for you. I made a video a while ago, I think last summer, and then I made a follow-up video, but I made a video last summer. I'll link to it above, about how, like, what Goldsmith is talking about and like what Richard is talking about in this passage is really, I would argue, manifesting advice and basically just auto-suggestion done properly. Auto-suggestion is what we're naturally suggesting to ourselves. And if you work with it, as we always talk about, if you work with what you're suggesting to yourself, you can change it to be more positive and expectant. And if you do it really well, you get like what Richard's talking about there, where you expect abundance, you recognize the abundance you already are, and you're suggesting that to yourself, and more of it flows your way, right? That's a lot of what Dollars Flow to Me Easily is all about, okay? Here's what I'm saying. As amazing and helpful as that advice is, and as practical as it is on a deep psychological level, I don't think it's deep spiritual advice. And I don't think these deeply like spiritual teachers, these quote unquote enlightened teachers, just manifest everything out of the blue perfectly. Their lives are just perfect. Quite the contrary. It's a different thing altogether, like what Richard's talking about. Richard's talking about suggesting something, expecting the best and getting the best by suggesting it, which is manifesting advice, and great manifesting advice, and something we can all focus on trying to do in our lives. But compare it with this. I'm going to read a passage from another book. Again, what a video this is. The Extraordinary Healing Power of Ordinary Things by Larry Dossey. I think I'm saying his last name right. Larry Dossey. The Extraordinary Healing Power of Ordinary Things. Great title. I'm going to read a passage from this book. I haven't read all this book. I got it from the library. It's I'm enjoying it, glancing at it. But this is a great passage. Larry's writing about spirituality here, not manifesting. Not that the two aren't related at all, but what Larry's writing about is what I would argue is a deeper form of spirituality. And now, you just heard Richard saying, listen, you recognize what you already are, and that's abundance, right? That seems pretty darn deep. And I get that. That is pretty darn deep. That maybe that's as deep as it seemingly you can go. But it's pointing still at by recognizing abundance, you get outward external abundance in the form of what you need, right? It's like a cause and effect thing. The spirituality, I think, that Larry Dossey is writing about here, it's not about cause and effect. It's not about, you recognize something and you get something in the outer world. It's something different, quieter, less blissful and, ecstatic, and more just grounded in truth, which you can't really even describe. This is what this passage is called, unhappiness and spirituality. Just compare this to what I just read. Dossey writes, many spiritual traditions assure us that it is indeed, quote unquote, spiritually correct to be unhappy from time to time. Unhappiness and happiness succeed each other like the seasons, and it is quite unnatural to be stuck permanently in some unchanging tropical paradise of positive emotion. As a Zen saying puts it, after ecstasy, the laundry. Some spiritual giants have actually seemed to turn away from the highest notes on the emotional scale. An example of that is St. Teresa of Avila, who, in a letter written in January 1577, said, I've had raptures again. They're most embarrassing. Several times in public, during matins, for instance. I'm so ashamed, I simply want to hide away somewhere. A similar attitude is common in Buddhism. A Zen master, after listening to one of his students report on the visions of light and true Buddhahood that he had experienced during meditation, responded soberly, keep meditating. It will go away. In a comparable story, one day it was announced by Master Joshu that the young monk Kyogen had reached an enlightened state. Much impressed by this news, several of his peers went to speak with him. We have heard that you are enlightened. Is this true? His fellow students inquired. It is, Kyogen answered. Tell us, said a friend. How do you feel? As miserable as ever, replied the enlightened Kyogen. Writer Natalie Goldberg relates an encounter with her Buddhist teacher, Katagiri Roshi, with whom she had previously studied for 6 years, which illustrates the appropriateness of negative emotions. When Goldberg finished her book, Writing Down the Bones, in Santa Fe in 1984, she felt the need to visit Roshi in Minneapolis again. She showed him the book and said, Roshi, I need a teacher again. The people in Santa Fe are crazy. They drift from one thing to another. Don't be so greedy, he replied, shaking his head. Writing is taking you very deep. Continue to write. But Roshi, it is so lonely. Is there anything wrong with loneliness? He asked, lifting his eyebrows. No, I guess not, she said. The conversation went on to other things. Suddenly she interrupted him. But Roshi, you have sentenced me to such loneliness. Writing is very lonely, she stressed again. Anything you do deeply is very lonely, he replied. Are you lonely? She asked him. Of course, he answered, but I do not let it toss me away. It is just loneliness. Frederick Douglass, one of America's towering black leaders of the 19th century, spoke about the polarities inherent in life. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Many great wisdom traditions have regarded unhappiness and suffering as steps towards wisdom. Mythologist Joseph Campbell affirmed this view, stating that human beings become wise in two ways. They may experience a sudden, unbidden revelation, an epiphany, or instant enlightenment, quote unquote, or they may suffer, which is far more common. To limit unhappiness, therefore, is to block one of the major pathways toward wisdom. And if the suffering is fully entered and engaged, it can be transformed, as many wise spiritual teachers maintain. An example comes from the life of Sri Ramana Maharishi, perhaps the most beloved saint of modern India. Maharishi was afflicted with cancer at the end of his life, and he would cry out in pain at night. His screams often prevented those who had come to study at his ashram from sleeping. Some of his devotees, wanting to put the best possible face on things, insisted that their teacher was not really in pain, but was using quote-unquote yogic control. On hearing this rationale, Maharishi objected. There is pain, he explained, but there is no suffering. A reminder that pain and serenity can coexist and are not required to annihilate each other. So I just thought that was a great passage from The Extraordinary Healing Power of Ordinary Things by Larry Dossey. I think I'm saying his last name right, hopefully. And I think it's interesting to hear a passage like that and then compare it to that great passage from Dots. There are no black and white answers here, and I'm not saying one thing is right or one thing is wrong in this video. I'm just saying there's a lot of nuance when it comes to, first of all, spirituality, what we would consider spiritual practices, and also when it comes to, manifesting a better life. Whatever that means to you, both on an inward emotional level and then outwardly in terms of your life changing externally. And there are an incredible amount of generalizations and talk of states of high ecstasy and bliss, especially online and in popular New Age, New Thought circles. And I think we have to question a lot of that. And we have to even question what great teachers like Richard Dotz perhaps are saying when they use language like that, and see if it's relevant to your own life. And it might be. But you also might find that it's not relevant. And as that excerpt we just read from the Dossey book indicates, it's totally fine if it's not relevant. It's totally fine if your idea and concept and experiences of fulfillment are not one of high ecstasy and the external world, everything just showing up magically and perfectly for you all the time. Again, I'm not saying that doesn't happen for some people, including perhaps for Richard Dotz. It sounds like it might. But God, truth, the universe, whatever you want to call it, is deeper than just that one thing. Truth is everything. And that implies a lot, more than we can just say with words. So I hope that this long video was helpful. You might want to listen to it again if you thought it made sense. It might make more sense if you listen to it again. And if you have any questions or would like coaching, I can be reached at radicalcounselor.com.